Sometimes life's most extraordinary moments come when we least expect them. And for Eleanor Mathis, a 72-year-old widow from a quiet Midwestern town, that moment arrived wrapped in the most unassuming package, a raffle ticket. Eleanor hadn't even planned to attend the local charity fundraiser that evening. Her best friend, Marie, had practically dragged her out of the house, insisting she needed a break from her solitary routine. It had been years since Eleanor had done anything remotely social, her days blending into one another in a monotonous rhythm of early morning tea, crossword puzzles, and the occasional walk around her overgrown backyard. The thought of mingling with strangers at the fundraiser felt exhausting, but Marie's persistence wore her down. "It's for a good cause, Ellie," Marie had said. "And besides, they're raffling off some big prize, a vacation or something." When the announcer revealed the grand prize, a picturesque countryside home nestled at the edge of a forest, Eleanor chuckled to herself. A house? She already had a house, small and modest as it was, and certainly didn't need another one. But Marie elbowed her, insisting she buy a ticket. With a reluctant sigh and a $20 bill, Eleanor secured her entry into what she thought was a futile gesture. As she walked home that evening under the dim glow of streetlights, Eleanor forgot about the ticket entirely. After all, people like her didn't win things like that. Life had taught her to keep her expectations low, a lesson learned over decades of hard work, heartbreak, and quiet resilience. But life, as Eleanor would soon learn, had other plans. A week later, as she sat by the window with her knitting needles in hand, the phone rang. The voice on the other end of the line introduced itself as belonging to someone from the charity organization. Eleanor barely listened, assuming it was a polite thank you call for her donation. But when the words "grand prize winner" left the woman's lips, Eleanor froze, the knitting needles clattering to the floor. "Excuse me, could you repeat that?" she stammered, clutching the phone with trembling hands. "You've won the dream home, Mrs. Mathis," the voice said cheerfully. "Congratulations." The days that followed were a blur of disbelief and cautious excitement. Marie was the first to hear the news, shrieking so loudly over the phone that Eleanor had to hold the receiver away from her ear. Neighbors began stopping by, offering congratulations and peppering her with questions about the house. Eleanor didn't know much yet, just that it was located a few hours away in a quiet rural area and boasted more rooms than she could ever imagine filling. For a woman who had spent most of her adult life in a small two-bedroom bungalow, the idea of owning such a grand property felt surreal, almost comical. But as the initial shock wore off, so did the doubt that had crept into her thoughts. Perhaps this was life's way of giving her a second chance, a fresh start she hadn't dared to dream of. When she finally made the trip to see the house for the first time, Eleanor was overwhelmed by its beauty. Nestled at the edge of a misty forest, the property seemed plucked from the pages of a storybook. A long gravel driveway led to a towering structure with ivy-covered walls, grand bay windows, and an intricately carved front door. It was nothing short of breathtaking. Yet, as Eleanor stood on the porch, clutching the brass key the charity had sent her, she couldn't shake a peculiar sense of unease. The house was too perfect, almost as though it had been waiting for her. The air felt heavy with an unspoken history, as if the walls themselves held secrets too heavy to share. Still, Eleanor dismissed her apprehension as nerves. Her late husband, Roger, had always teased her for being too cautious, too afraid to take risks. "Sometimes you've got to leap before you look," he used to say, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Eleanor had never been much of a leaper, but now standing before this magnificent house, she decided it was time to take that leap. This was her opportunity to rewrite the lonely narrative of her golden years. With trembling hands and a deep breath, she pushed open the front door, stepping into what she believed would be a dream come true. Little did she know, the house held more than just charm and elegance. Behind its pristine facade lay a labyrinth of secrets, and as Eleanor would soon discover, some dreams come with a price. Eleanor's first days in the house were a whirlwind of wonder and adjustment. The sheer size of the home made her feel like a child wandering through a palace, marveling at every ornate detail she encountered. The high ceilings seemed to echo her every step, and the polished wooden floors gleamed under the soft light filtering through lace curtains that adorned the towering windows. Each room was a world unto itself, brimming with character and charm. There was a library with shelves that climbed all the way to the ceiling, a kitchen that looked as though it belonged in a cooking show, and a sunroom with sweeping views of the forest. It all felt impossibly luxurious, far removed from the modest bungalow she had called home for over 4 decades. Yet, as enchanting as the house was, it also felt strangely unfamiliar, like trying on a beautiful coat that didn't quite fit. Unpacking her belongings was a bittersweet task. Eleanor's life had always been simple, her possessions few and practical. Her furniture, worn but comfortable, looked out of place against the grandeur of the house. The small knickknacks and photo frames she had accumulated over the years seemed almost insignificant on the vast mantels and tables. She arranged and rearranged them, trying to create a sense of warmth and belonging, but felt like the house resisted her attempts, its grandeur swallowing her efforts whole. "I suppose it'll take time," she muttered to herself, placing an old photograph of her and Roger on a side table near the living room window. The picture, taken during their honeymoon, was one of her most cherished possessions. Roger had always been the adventurous one, the dreamer, while Eleanor was the steady, practical partner. He would have loved this house, she thought wistfully. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor began to explore the house more thoroughly. There were nooks and crannies everywhere, hidden compartments in the walls, an attic filled with dusty trunks, and a basement that seemed untouched for decades. She found herself drawn to the mystery of it all, each discovery sparking a curiosity she hadn't felt in years. One morning, while dusting a hallway lined with ornate portraits, she noticed something peculiar, a door at the end of the corridor that didn't seem to belong. It was smaller than the others, with no knob or visible hinges, almost as if it were trying to remain unnoticed. Eleanor pressed her ear against it, half expecting to hear something on the other side, but there was only silence. She tried pushing it, even tapping it with a broom handle, but it didn't budge. The locked door became a fixation for Eleanor. She dreamed about it at night and thought about it constantly during the day. Who had locked it? Why? What could possibly be inside? Her imagination ran wild with possibilities. A hidden room, a forgotten treasure, or perhaps even a terrible secret. The rational part of her told her it was likely nothing more than an old storage space, but a deeper instinct whispered otherwise. There was something about this house, something that called to her in a way she couldn't explain. The door, with its stubborn silence, seemed to hold the key to whatever the house was trying to tell her. Determined to find answers, Eleanor began scouring the house for clues. She searched through old trunks in the attic, rifled through drawers in the study, and even ventured into the basement, where the air was damp and heavy with the scent of earth and time. She found papers, deeds, letters, and receipts, but nothing that explained the door. In the library, she combed through books, hoping one of them might conceal a hidden key, but her search yielded nothing. Still, she refused to give up. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt alive with purpose. The mystery of the door gave her a reason to wake up each morning, a goal to pursue, and a spark of excitement that had long been missing from her life. Yet, as much as the house intrigued her, it also unnerved her. At night, when the wind howled through the trees outside, the old pipes groaned, and the floors creaked under the weight of memories she couldn't yet uncover. Sometimes she felt as though she wasn't alone, as if the house itself was watching her, waiting for her to discover something it had kept hidden for far too long. Despite the unease, Eleanor pressed on, driven by a determination that surprised even herself. She had spent so much of her life playing it safe, avoiding risks and adventures. Now, in her twilight years, she was chasing a mystery that felt bigger than herself, as if solving it might somehow unlock a part of her she had long forgotten. The house had a way of pulling her in, and Eleanor found herself becoming more attached to it with each passing day. She began to learn its quirks, the way the morning light danced across the dining room table, the way the old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed slightly offbeat, and the peculiar way the front door resisted closing unless you gave it a firm push. Slowly but surely, she was making the house her own. But the locked door remained an enigma, a constant reminder that the house still held secrets it wasn't ready to reveal. Eleanor often found herself standing in front of it, running her fingers along its edges, as if willing it to open. "You'll give up your secrets eventually," she whispered one evening, her voice echoing softly in the empty hallway. Little did Eleanor know the locked door was only the beginning. What lay behind it would not only change her understanding of the house, but also her understanding of herself and the life she thought she had left behind. The house wasn't just a prize she had won. It was a chapter of her story that had been waiting for her to arrive. And as Eleanor stood on the brink of discovery, she couldn't help but feel that her life, long marked by routine and restraint, was finally about to begin again. Eleanor could never have predicted how the mystery of the locked door would consume her. It became a puzzle she couldn't stop turning over in her mind, a lingering question that seemed to grow louder with each passing day. The house, for all its grandeur and charm, now felt incomplete to her, like a story missing its final chapter. That small, unobtrusive door at the end of the hallway had woven itself into her routine, an unanswered question she felt destined to solve. Each morning, she made her tea and gazed at the door as if it might open of its own accord. Each night, she walked past it with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. It wasn't just a locked room. It was a challenge, a silent invitation to uncover the house's deepest secrets. Her search for answers became methodical. Eleanor started with the obvious places: the drawers in the kitchen, the cabinets in the study, and the bedside tables in the upstairs bedrooms. She sifted through piles of aged papers, receipts, and letters left behind by the house's previous owners. Most were mundane, filled with grocery lists and correspondence that hinted at an ordinary family life. Yet, buried among the clutter, she found small clues that began to weave a tapestry of the house's past. There were faded photographs of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, posing in front of the very house she now called home. They looked happy, their smiles wide and unrestrained, but something about the photographs unsettled Eleanor. The way the wife's hand rested on her husband's arm seemed almost too firm, too deliberate, as if she were trying to anchor herself to something she feared might slip away. As Eleanor dug deeper, the house began to feel alive, as though it wanted her to find something. One afternoon, while cleaning the library, she discovered a false back in one of the shelves. Behind it was a small leather-bound journal, with its pages yellowed by time. The handwriting was elegant but difficult to read. The ink faded in places. The journal belonged to the woman in the photographs, Margaret Whittaker, and as Eleanor read through its entries, she was drawn into a life marked by both beauty and heartbreak. Margaret wrote about the house with great affection, describing it as her sanctuary, but there were darker passages too. She wrote of nights spent pacing the halls, of arguments with her husband, and of a terrible mistake that haunted her. Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if the locked room had something to do with that mistake. The journal mentioned it only once, in an entry written in a trembling hand. "The room holds everything I cannot bear to face. I pray no one will ever open it." The discovery of the journal only deepened the mystery. What could be so terrible that someone would go to such lengths to lock it away? Eleanor's imagination ran wild. Could it be something criminal, something scandalous? Or was it something far more personal, a grief or regret too heavy to confront? The more she thought about it, the more she felt a strange kinship with Margaret. Eleanor, too, had her share of regrets, her own locked doors she had chosen not to open. The journal felt like a bridge across time, connecting two women who had never met but who shared a profound understanding of life's complexities. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor's determination grew. She began scouring the house for anything that might serve as a key. She combed through the attic, her hands covered in dust as she opened one old trunk after another. She searched the basement, where the air was damp and smelled of mildew, feeling along the stone walls for any hidden compartments. She even checked the garden, digging around the base of an ancient oak tree that seemed to guard the property like a silent sentinel. But no matter where she looked, the key eluded her. Frustration gnawed at her, but so did something else, a growing sense that the house was testing her, making her earn its secrets. One evening, as she sat by the fire with a journal in her lap, Eleanor noticed something she hadn't seen before. At the back of the journal, pressed between two brittle pages, was a small folded piece of paper. Carefully, she unfolded it to reveal a hand-drawn map of the house. Most of it was familiar: the grand living room, the sunlit kitchen, the winding staircase. But there was one section that caught her attention. It was labeled the Forgotten Room. The map showed a passage leading to the locked door, but it also hinted at something else, a small, concealed cabinet in the study that seemed to hold the key. With her heart pounding, Eleanor rushed to the study, her hands trembling as she examined every inch of the room. Finally, behind a stack of books on a low shelf, she found it, a hidden compartment carved into the wood. Inside was a single object, a delicate brass key that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Eleanor held it in her hands, her breath catching in her throat. This was it, the key to the locked room, the answer to the question that had consumed her for weeks. But now that she had it, Eleanor hesitated. What if Margaret's warning was justified? What if opening the room revealed something she wasn't prepared to face? She thought of the journal, of the pain and regret woven into its pages, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt. The house had already changed her in ways she hadn't expected, forcing her to confront emotions she had long buried. Did she really want to uncover more? Standing in the study, the key heavy in her hand, Eleanor realized she was standing at a crossroads, not just in the house, but in her life. The decision to open the door wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about facing the unknown, about choosing courage over fear. With a deep breath, she tightened her grip on the key and made her way down the hallway. The door stood before her, silent and unyielding, as if daring her to turn back. But Eleanor had come too far to stop now. She inserted the key into the lock, her hands trembling, and with a soft click, the door finally gave way. As it creaked open, a rush of air escaped, carrying with it the scent of time and memory. What lay beyond the threshold was more than Eleanor had ever imagined, and as she stepped inside, she knew her life would never be the same. The door creaked open slowly, the sound echoing down the long, silent hallway. Eleanor stood motionless, her hand still gripping the brass key, as though it were an anchor tethering her to reality. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with the unmistakable weight of time and abandonment. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, before reaching for the light switch. The bulb flickered to life, casting a pale yellow glow over a space that seemed frozen in another era. The room was smaller than she had imagined, but no less captivating. Every inch of it was a tableau of forgotten history, a snapshot of a life paused mid-motion and left untouched for decades. Eleanor's eyes scanned a room, drinking in the details. A small writing desk sat against one wall, its surface cluttered with faded papers, an old inkwell, and a single fountain pen lying askew as if abandoned mid-sentence. To the right, a rocking chair stood in the corner, draped with a quilt that looked handmade, its vibrant colors dulled by layers of dust. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, their spines cracked and titles obscured by time. But what caught Eleanor's attention most was a large chest in the center of the room, its lid slightly ajar as though inviting her to look inside. She approached the chest cautiously, her mind racing with possibilities. Margaret Whittaker's journal had hinted at a terrible mistake, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in this room would finally reveal what that mistake had been. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, she found a collection of items that told a story so intimate and haunting that it took her breath away. There were photographs, dozens of them, depicting the Whittaker family in moments of both joy and sorrow. One image showed Margaret holding a baby in her arms, her face alight with a radiant smile. But as Eleanor flipped through the stack, the photographs began to change. The smiles faded, replaced by solemn expressions, and eventually, the baby disappeared from the images altogether. Beneath the photographs, Eleanor found a bundle of letters tied together with a frayed ribbon. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. The letters were written by Margaret to someone named Grace, a name Eleanor hadn't encountered in any of the papers or the journals she had found earlier. As she read, the story began to unfold. Grace, it seemed, was Margaret's sister, and the two women had shared a bond that was both loving and fraught with tension. The letters spoke of a falling out, a harsh words exchanged, and wounds that had never healed. But the most shocking revelation came in the final letter, dated years after the others. In it, Margaret confessed to something she had never told anyone. The baby in the photographs was not her child. Grace, unmarried and facing scandal, had given birth in secret, and Margaret had taken the child in to protect her sister's reputation. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine as she pieced the story together. The baby, whose name was Thomas, had been raised as Margaret's own son. But something had gone wrong, something terrible that had driven Margaret to lock this room away and leave it untouched. Digging deeper into the chest, Eleanor found more clues: a small hand-knitted baby sweater, a rattle, and a medical record that made her stomach drop. The record revealed that Thomas had died at just 3 years old, the victim of a sudden illness that no one could have predicted. The grief and guilt that Margaret must have felt were unimaginable, and Eleanor realized that the terrible mistake Margaret had written about was not just taking in her sister's child, but failing to save him. The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on Eleanor's chest. She sat down in the rocking chair, clutching the baby's sweater as tears welled up in her eyes. It was impossible not to feel the echoes of Margaret's pain, her sense of failure, and the unbearable loss that had led her to seal this room away. Eleanor thought of her own life, of the choices she had made, and the regrets she carried. She thought of her estranged son, Michael, and the years they had lost after a bitter argument that neither of them had been willing to mend. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt the sharp pang of loneliness, not as a quiet ache, but as a deep, gnawing wound. But the room held more than just sadness. It held a strange kind of beauty, too. Margaret's love for Thomas was evident in every carefully preserved artifact, every heartfelt word in her letters. It was a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, love had a way of enduring, of leaving its mark long after the people who shared it were gone. Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if the house had been waiting for her, calling her here to uncover this story and in doing so, confront her own. As she sat there, surrounded by the remnants of another family's life, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't change the past, neither Margaret's nor her own, but she could choose to face it, to acknowledge the pain, and let it guide her towards something better. She thought of Michael and the family he had built without her, of the grandchildren she had never met. It wasn't too late, she realized, to reach out, to try and mend what had been broken. The hidden room had revealed more than just a story. It had revealed a path forward. Eleanor didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew she couldn't go back to the way things were. The house, with all its secrets and sorrows, had changed her, and for the first time in years, she felt ready to change herself. As she closed the chest and rose from the rocking chair, Eleanor glanced around the room one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but filled with gratitude. The house had given her more than a place to live. It had given her a reason to keep living. Eleanor couldn't sleep that night. The revelations of the hidden room lingered in her mind, wrapping themselves around her thoughts like tendrils of fog. She lay in bed, staring at the ornate ceiling, her heart heavy with the weight of Margaret Whittaker's story. The woman's grief, her guilt, and her unwavering love for a child who wasn't biologically hers felt like echoes of a distant, haunting melody. Eleanor wondered if the house had absorbed those emotions, if its very walls had become a vessel for Margaret's sorrow. The idea seemed far-fetched, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this house, with all its secrets, had been waiting for her, waiting for someone who could understand its pain. The next morning, Eleanor awoke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She decided to delve deeper into the history of the house, determined to uncover the full story of the Whittaker family. If Margaret's journal and the hidden room were any indication, there was much more to learn. With a notebook in hand, she began her investigation, starting with the local library. The librarian, a kind woman named Dorothy, was more than happy to help, her eyes lighting up at the mention of the Whittaker estate. "That house has a lot of history," Dorothy said, pulling out a stack of old newspapers and records. "It's been in the Whittaker family for generations, but it hasn't always been a happy home." Eleanor spent hours poring over the documents, each piece adding another layer to the story. She learned that the house had been built in the late 1800s by Margaret's great-grandfather, a wealthy industrialist who had spared no expense in its construction. Over the years, it had been passed down through the family, each generation leaving its mark. But the Whittakers' wealth and influence hadn't shielded them from tragedy. There were whispers of financial troubles, family feuds, and untimely deaths. Eleanor discovered an article about Margaret's husband, Harold, who had died under mysterious circumstances shortly after the loss of their adopted son, Thomas. The article described Harold as a reclusive man, prone to fits of anger, and hinted at the possibility of foul play. The more Eleanor uncovered, the more the house seemed to come alive in her imagination. It wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing entity shaped by the joys and sorrows of the people who had called it home. She could almost hear their voices in the creak of the floorboards, feel their presence in the chill that seemed to linger in certain rooms. The idea of a house holding memories, of being haunted not by spirits but by the weight of its past, fascinated and unsettled her in equal measure. She began to see the house not just as a home, but as a repository of stories, each one waiting to be uncovered. Back at the house, Eleanor explored with renewed curiosity, looking for any clues she might have missed. In the basement, she found an old trunk filled with Harold's belongings, a dusty journal, a pair of spectacles, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. The journal, unlike Margaret's, was terse and factual, filled with notes about the estate and its finances. But the letters were something else entirely. Written in a bold, confident hand, they revealed an aspect of Harold's life Eleanor hadn't expected. They were love letters, passionate and deeply personal, addressed not to Margaret but to a man named Edward. The discovery left Eleanor reeling. In her time, such a relationship would have been scandalous, and she could only imagine the weight Harold must have carried, hiding his true self from the world. She wondered if Margaret had known, if their marriage had been one of convenience rather than love, and how their relationship had shaped the events that followed. The letters painted a picture of a man torn between duty and desire, of a love that could never fully be realized. They added another layer of complexity to the Whittaker family story, deepening Eleanor's empathy for the people who had lived there. As Eleanor pieced together the fragments of the past, she began to see parallels to her own life. Like Margaret and Harold, she had spent much of her life hiding parts of herself, burying emotions she didn't know how to confront. Her estrangement from her son, Michael, was a wound she had carried for years, one she had never found the courage to heal. She thought of the argument that had driven them apart, a heated exchange about Michael's decision to move across the country with his wife and children. At the time, Eleanor had felt abandoned, betrayed by the son she had raised alone after Roger's death. But now, looking back, she saw the fear and pride that had kept her from reaching out, from apologizing for the words she had said in anger. The house seemed to be urging her toward reconciliation, its story a mirror reflecting her own. Eleanor began to feel a growing sense of urgency, as though time were running out. The past was unchangeable, but the present was still within her grasp. She thought of Margaret's words in the journal, her plea for forgiveness and understanding. Margaret had never been able to mend her relationship with her sister, Grace, and Eleanor didn't want to make the same mistake. She resolved to contact Michael to try and bridge the gap between them before it was too late. That evening, as she sat by the fire, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace. The house, with all its shadows and secrets, had become a part of her, its story intertwined with her own. She thought of Margaret and Harold, of Thomas and Grace, and of the love and loss that had defined their lives. The house had borne witness to it all, standing as a silent testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And now it was giving Eleanor a chance to write a new chapter, one of forgiveness, understanding, and hope. But even as she made her plans, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had more to reveal. The mysteries she had uncovered were profound, but they felt like pieces of a larger puzzle, one she hadn't yet solved. The haunting past of the dream home wasn't just a story of tragedy. It was a story of choices, of the paths people take and the ones they leave behind. And as Eleanor prepared to face her own choices, she knew the house would guide her, its whispers urging her toward the truth that lay just beyond her reach. The house had become more than a place to live. It had become Eleanor's companion, her confidant, and her teacher. Each discovery she made, each fragment of the Whitaker family's story she pieced together, seemed to reflect something in her own life, forcing her to confront truths she had long buried. The journey into the house's past had started as a curiosity, a desire to uncover its secrets, but it had grown into something much deeper, a confrontation with herself. As the days passed, Eleanor found herself thinking not just about Margaret and Harold, but about her own choices, her own regrets, and the relationships she had let slip away. One afternoon, as she sat in the sunroom, the Whitakers' letters spread out before her. Eleanor realized how much her perspective had shifted. For years, she had clung to the belief that she had been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. A widow left to raise a son on her own, a mother abandoned by that same son when he started his own family. But now she saw things differently. Margaret's story, filled with heartbreak and resilience, had taught Eleanor that life was rarely as simple as she had once believed. People made mistakes. They hurt one another, often without meaning to. And while some wounds were too deep to heal, others only needed the courage to reach out and try. Eleanor began to reflect on her relationship with Michael. The argument that had driven them apart felt trivial now, a small spark that had ignited years of silence. She thought about the things she had said in anger, the accusations she had thrown at him when he announced his decision to move across the country. "You're abandoning me," she had said, the words laced with pain and bitterness. At the time, she had believed them. But now, as she sat in the quiet warmth of the sunroom, she saw how unfair she had been. Michael hadn't abandoned her. He had been trying to build a life for himself, just as she had done when she was young. The realization was both humbling and freeing. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt ready to let go of her resentment. But letting go was easier said than done. Eleanor had spent so long clinging to her pain that it had become a part of her, a shield she used to protect herself from the vulnerability of hope. The thought of reaching out to Michael terrified her. What if he didn't want to mend their relationship? What if he rejected her? The questions swirled in her mind, paralyzing her with doubt. And yet, the house seemed to push her forward, its story urging her to take the risk. Margaret's letters to Grace, filled with regret and longing, were a constant reminder of what could happen when pride and fear kept people apart. Eleanor decided to start small. She wrote a letter to Michael, pouring her heart onto the page. She apologized for the things she had said, for the years she had let slip away without reaching out. She told him about the house, about the Whitaker family, and about how their story had made her realize the importance of forgiveness. "I don't expect everything to be perfect," she wrote, "but I hope we can start again. I miss you." As she sealed the envelope, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her chest. It wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning. The process of writing the letter felt cathartic, as though Eleanor were not just reaching out to Michael, but also to herself. For years, she had lived with a quiet but persistent sense of failure, a belief that she had let Roger down by not keeping their family together. But now she saw that failure differently. It wasn't in the mistakes she had made or the arguments she had lost, but in her refusal to confront those moments and try to move past them. The house, with its hidden room and its layers of history, had shown her that even the most painful truths could be faced, and that doing so often led to growth. Eleanor's newfound courage extended beyond her relationship with Michael. She began to embrace other parts of her life that she had neglected for years. She ventured into the nearby town, making an effort to meet her neighbors and engage with the community. She joined a book club at the library, where she shared her thoughts on novels and found herself laughing more than she had in years. She even began tending to the overgrown garden behind the house, turning it into a colorful oasis of flowers and vegetables. Each small act felt like a step toward reclaiming the parts of herself she had lost over time. The transformation wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of the past threatened to pull her back into old habits, days when the silence of the house felt suffocating. But Eleanor had learned to push through those moments, to remind herself that growth was never linear. Margaret's story, with all its pain and complexity, had taught her that healing was a process, one that required patience and determination. And Eleanor, despite her doubts, was determined to keep moving forward. As the weeks turned into months, Eleanor began to feel a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The house, once a symbol of mystery and unease, had become her sanctuary. Its walls, which had seemed so imposing at first, now felt like the arms of an old friend, holding her steady as she navigated this new chapter of her life. And though the Whitakers' story still lingered in her mind, it no longer felt like a weight. Instead, it felt like a gift, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to endure even in the face of loss. Eleanor's letter to Michael remained unanswered for weeks, and though she tried not to let it discourage her, the silence stung. But one crisp autumn morning, as she tended to the roses in her garden, she heard the sound of a car pulling up the gravel driveway. She turned, her heart leaping as she saw Michael step out, his face a mixture of hesitation and hope. Behind him were his wife and 2 children, their curious eyes taking in the grandeur of the house. Eleanor felt tears well up in her eyes as she approached them, her hands trembling but her heart steady. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had feared might never come. The reunion was awkward at first, filled with stilted words and nervous smiles. But as the day went on, the barriers between them began to fall away. Eleanor told Michael about the Whitakers, about the locked room and the letters, and about how their story had inspired her to reach out. Michael listened, his expression softening with each word. "I've missed you too, Mom," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. And in that moment, Eleanor felt a sense of wholeness she hadn't known in years. The house had given her a second chance, not just with Michael, but with herself. The house that once felt like a relic of the past was now alive with voices and laughter. Eleanor could hardly believe how much had changed in just a few short weeks. Michael's visit had been the turning point she'd hoped for, and the bridge between them, once weathered and splintered, was slowly being rebuilt. Michael returned again the following weekend, this time staying longer, helping Eleanor repair some of the more neglected parts of the house. His wife, Emily, brought baked goods and a cheerful demeanor, while their children, Clara and Sam, explored the house with wide-eyed wonder. The sight of her grandchildren running down the hallways, their laughter echoing off the walls, brought a warmth to Eleanor's heart that she hadn't felt in years. But even as she embraced this newfound connection to her family, Eleanor couldn't ignore the way the house seemed to pull her toward the present while tethering her to the past. The Whitakers' story lingered in her thoughts, their joys and sorrows a constant reminder of life's fragility. The hidden room had revealed so much, but Eleanor had a nagging feeling that the house wasn't done with her yet. There were still unanswered questions, still pieces of the puzzle she hadn't put together. One day, as she watched Clara and Sam play in the garden, Eleanor decided it was time to share the story with her family. That evening, after dinner, Eleanor gathered everyone in the living room. The fire crackled on the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls as she began to speak. She told them about the locked room, about Margaret and Harold, and about the heartbreaking loss of their adopted son Thomas. She shared her discovery of Harold's letters to Edward and the way they had revealed a man trapped between duty and love. As she spoke, she could see the impact of the story on her family. Emily wiped away a tear, while Michael listened intently, his expression a mixture of sadness and curiosity. Even Clara and Sam, too young to fully grasp the weight of the story, seemed captivated by the tale of the house's former occupants. "I think this house has a way of holding on to its history," Eleanor said, her voice soft but steady. "It's not just walls and furniture, it's memories. And I think it brought me here for a reason, to learn from the people who came before us and to share their story with you." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of the people she loved. "I've spent so much of my life hiding from the past, afraid to face my mistakes. But this house has shown me that our stories, even the painful ones, deserve to be told. They're what make us who we are." Michael reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I'm glad you shared this with us, Mom," he said. "And I'm glad we're here with you now. This house, it's special. And so are you." His words brought a lump to Eleanor's throat, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Instead, she squeezed his hand and smiled, the kind of smile that carried years of unspoken gratitude. The Whitakers' story became a point of connection for Eleanor and her family. Over the next few weeks, they worked together to catalog the artifacts from the hidden room, preserving them as a tribute to the family that had once called the house their own. Michael, ever the practical one, suggested reaching out to a local historian to help piece together the gaps in the story, while Clara and Sam took it upon themselves to create a scrapbook filled with photographs and notes about the Whitakers. The project brought them closer together, giving them a shared purpose and a deeper appreciation for the house and its history. But the house wasn't content to let the past remain in the background. One evening, as Eleanor sorted through a box of old papers in the attic, she came across something that stopped her in her tracks. A deed to the house, signed not by Harold or Margaret Whitaker, but by a name she recognized all too well, her own grandmother, Lillian Hayes. The discovery sent a jolt of shock through Eleanor's body. How could her grandmother's name be on a deed to this house? She had always believed that her grandmother had lived her entire life in a small town hundreds of miles away. Eleanor brought the deed downstairs, her mind racing with questions. She spread it out on the dining room table, examining the details. The date on the deed placed it decades before Eleanor was born, during a time when her grandmother would have been a young woman. The idea that her family had once been connected to this house felt both impossible and inevitable, as though the house had been waiting for her all along. She thought of the stories her grandmother had told her as a child, of a great love she had lost and never spoken of again. Could the house be the key to uncovering that story? Eleanor shared the discovery with Michael and Emily the next morning. Together, they began to piece together the fragments of the past, searching through old family records and reaching out to local archives for more information. What they uncovered was a tale that deepened the connection between Eleanor and the house in ways she hadn't imagined. Lillian Hayes, it seemed, had once been engaged to a man who had lived in the house, a man who had died suddenly, leaving her heartbroken. Unable to bear the memories, Lillian had sold the house and started a new life far away, vowing never to speak of her loss. The revelation left Eleanor reeling. The house wasn't just a place she had won in a raffle. It was a part of her family's history, a link to a story that had shaped the lives of those who came before her. The realization brought with it a sense of closure, as though the house had finally revealed its true purpose. It wasn't just a home. It was a bridge between the past and the present, a place where stories intertwined and where healing could begin. For Eleanor, the discovery was more than just a piece of family history. It was a reminder of the enduring power of love and the importance of honoring the stories that had come before. As she stood in the sunroom that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold, she felt a profound sense of peace. The house had given her more than she could have ever imagined: connection, purpose, and the courage to face her own story. And as she turned to join her family in the living room, she knew that the best chapters of her life were still waiting to be written. Eleanor felt as though the house had finally given up its secrets. The hidden room, the Whitaker family's story, and now the revelation about her grandmother's connection to the estate had brought her a sense of closure she hadn't expected when she first arrived. But just as she began to settle into this new chapter of her life, the house revealed one final twist, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her family and herself. It began with an old photograph that Clara discovered while helping Eleanor sort through the attic. The picture was tucked away in the back of a dusty album, its edges frayed and its surface slightly faded. It showed a group of people standing on the front steps of the house, their faces frozen in time. At first, Eleanor thought it was just another image of the Whitaker family, but as she looked closer, her breath caught in her throat. Among the faces in the photograph was a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to her grandmother, Lillian. Eleanor stared at the image, her hands trembling. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was her. The date on the back of the photograph placed it just a few years before Eleanor's mother was born. The implications were staggering. If Lillian had been in the house during that time, it meant that the man she had once been engaged to, the man she had never spoken about, might not have been just a fleeting chapter in her life. Determined to uncover the truth, Eleanor dove back into her research, combing through every document, letter, and photograph she could find. She even reached out to the local historian Michael had contacted earlier, who helped her track down additional records. What they found was a story that turned Eleanor's understanding of her family on its head. The man in question, it seemed, was not just Lillian's fiancé. He was her mother's biological father. Eleanor's grandmother had been pregnant when she left the house, her heartbreak compounded by the loss of the man she loved. She had returned to her hometown, married a kind but quiet man who had raised Eleanor's mother as his own, and buried the truth so deeply that not even her closest family had known. The discovery left Eleanor reeling. Her family's history, once a straightforward narrative of resilience and love, was now layered with secrets and sacrifices she had never imagined. Eleanor struggled to process the revelation. On one hand, it felt like a betrayal, another hidden truth in a house full of them. But on the other, it felt like a gift. Her grandmother's story, like Margaret's, was one of love and loss, of choices made in the face of impossible circumstances. And like Margaret, Lillian had carried her secrets not out of malice, but out of a desire to protect her family. Eleanor couldn't help but wonder how different her grandmother's life might have been if she had felt free to share her story, if she hadn't been bound by the expectations and judgments of her time. As Eleanor shared the discovery with Michael and Emily, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The house wasn't just a place to live. It was a place to learn, to grow, and to honor the stories of those who had come before. Michael, ever the voice of reason, suggested organizing a small gathering to share the house's history with the local community. "It's not just your story, Mom," he said. "It's a part of this town's history, too. People should know." Eleanor agreed, though the idea of speaking in front of a crowd made her nervous. Still, she knew he was right. The house had been waiting for someone to tell its story, and now it felt like her responsibility. The event, held on a crisp autumn afternoon, was a quiet but heartfelt affair. Neighbors and townsfolk gathered in the living room, their faces lit with curiosity as Eleanor recounted the tales of the Whitaker family and her own grandmother. She spoke with a confidence she hadn't known she possessed, her voice steady as she wove together the threads of love, loss, and resilience that had defined the house's history. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The applause that followed felt like a validation, not just of the story she had told, but of the journey she had taken to get there. But the house wasn't done with her yet. That evening, after the guests had left and the house had fallen silent, Eleanor found herself drawn back to the hidden room. She hadn't been inside since the day she first opened it, and as she stood in the doorway, she felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, nostalgia, and a lingering sense of anticipation. The room was just as she had left it, the chest still open and the letters neatly stacked on the desk. But as her eyes scanned the space, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a small envelope tucked behind a book on one of the shelves. Eleanor pulled the envelope free, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its edges yellowed with age. The note, written in Margaret's elegant hand, was addressed to the next keeper of this house. Eleanor's breath caught as she read the words. Margaret had written the note as a kind of farewell, a final message for whoever would one day uncover the room and its secrets. "This house," the letter began, "has been both a blessing and a burden. It holds our joys and our sorrows, our triumphs and our regrets. To the one who finds this letter, I hope you will carry its stories forward, not as weights to bear, but as gifts to share." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she finished the letter. The house had been more than a home. It had been a vessel for the Whitaker family's legacy, a place where love and loss coexisted, where stories intertwined and lives were transformed. And now it had become her legacy, too. The house had given her a second chance, not just to reconnect with her family, but to find herself. As Eleanor folded the letter and placed it carefully back in its envelope, she felt a profound sense of peace. The house, with all its secrets and surprises, had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. And as she turned off the light and closed the door to the hidden room, she knew that while the house's story was far from over, her own chapter in it had just begun.